Good afternoon, Girl Scout Network. I'm Ava Castleton, manager of alum events at Girl Scouts of the USA, and I'm so excited to present to you our Campfire Chat personal essay writing with Girl Scout alum, memoirist, and former books editor of Oprah.com, Leigh Newman. Leigh has edited some of America's favorite writers, from Toni Morrison to Brené Brown, and her techniques are sure to help you too. We're looking forward to getting started with this event shortly. We also wanted to let you know that we'll have more scheduled events in the near future, including a panel with Leigh next week, for which you can register at girlscouts.org/campfirechats. There, you'll also find recordings of past events, which are hosted virtually and broadcast live. Now let's get started. I'm thrilled to introduce literary whiz Leigh Newman, who will walk us through how to begin to translate your journal entries into essays with heart and soul. I'll be sharing your questions with Leigh, so don't be afraid to type them in the question box. Don't forget to tag social posts with #CampfireChats and @Girl Scouts. We can't wait to hear how you're using Leigh's essay writing techniques with your own lives. We'll be sharing examples of essays in the chat log, and at the end of the broadcast, you'll have an opportunity to support Girl Scouts with Cookie Cares, and you can also find that link in the chat log. Leigh, it's so great to have you back.
Yes, it is. Hi, it is great to be back. So today we're going to talk about essay writing. Last time we talked about journaling, and I think this is a wonderful natural follow-up to that subject, because journaling and essay writing are very similar. I mean, you can even take the material that you've journaled and turn it into an essay. It's just a more polished way of telling a story, and it is a really exciting form. Personally, for me, I love it. It's what really made me start being a writer. It is a precursor if you've ever thought about writing a memoir. I wrote my first, I'm just pointing to my memoir, but I wrote my first real personal essay, I think, for the New York Times, and then moved on to memoir writing. But even if you have no aspirations of being a professional writer, essay writing can help you look back on your past and reflect on what happened. It can help you just codify different ways you want to talk about big events in your life. It can be like a great gift, honestly, to write a personal essay for somebody in your family. I know that my father has written some essays just about growing up and his childhood, and I love reading them. And so did my great uncle, actually. So it can just enrich your life and be a lot of fun. I think there are sometimes some obstacles about writing a personal essay. We see them all the time right now in the world. They're constantly in most publications you'll read. They're in Vogue, they're in Oprah magazine, they're in Real Simple, they're in Good Housekeeping, they're in almost all major newspapers have some kind of essay. New York Times, Washington Post, doesn't really matter the newspaper, but you'll see them in those places, and they're all over the internet. I think it's a form that people really can relate to because it actually happened and it's readable, in 10 minutes. A personal essay can be 300 words. It can be 3,500 words. You get to pick that. But I think what intimidates the non-professional writer from writing them, and it's unfortunate, is that sometimes we just see the word essay and it feels boring. It feels flat. It feels like what we had to sit in fourth grade and map out the 5-paragraph essay. I hear my own son talking about the 5-paragraph essay where you have to have a thesis. And I remember the thesis he wrote, which was, snakes are interesting. And you had to start that essay with something exciting like a dictionary definition of snakes, or a question like, do you think snakes are interesting? Then you had to prove that thesis. Snakes are interesting with 3 points. Remember, snakes are interesting because they have eggs. Snakes are interesting because they have scales. Snakes are interesting because some of them are poisonous. And then you'd have to conclude, right? And repeat those same points all over again. I'm sure there's this is a useful thing for people to do in school and organizing their thoughts, but in a personal essay, we don't have to follow that formula whatsoever. In fact, that's what makes personal essays really exciting. It's storytelling. It's exactly why you'd read a novel, why you'd read a memoir, why you watch television. Television is storytelling. And so this is just in a more compact form. I think what also intimidates people who aren't like used to writing a lot of personal essays is they think their writing isn't, quote, good enough. I always struggle with this too, even though I'm a writer. I think every writer does. And I think that if, like maybe there's a magical, super confident person out there that can just sit down and it's all perfect and they never have any doubts. But I think for most of us, we do think, oh, well, I wrote in my journal, or I'm writing, I write things or I think about things, but I couldn't just actually write an essay. But you can. I mean, you just write it. The thing that I always go back to is I end up worrying about being good enough for about 5 hours. And then once I finally write, it doesn't matter. It just comes out. Ben Go used to say, if you're worried you cannot paint, by all means paint, and that worry will go away. I actually probably massacred that quote by Van Gogh, but because I'm terrible at memorizing, but that's sort of my go-to phrase whenever I feel intimidated that it has to be perfect right from the get-go. So one way to sort of ease into essay writing is to sort of look at different kinds of essays that work. For example, if you were sewing a dress or something, you wouldn't just like get some fabric and start cutting up with scissors and then just go to the sewing machine and sew up some seams. You would get a pattern. And there are some kinds of patterns. I don't think they're official. They're patterns that I see and I even kind of invented as my own methodology that can help you kick off how to write an essay and what we think personal essays are. One of my favorite, and I think the easiest and most fun ways to begin a personal essay is a list. I know I talked about lists in journal writing, but in essay writing, they can be fantastic. So they can also just like help you organize your thoughts and don't require a lot of like dialogue and other things. So one essay that we just shared with you is one that I wrote at Oprah years ago called 12 Things I'm Too Stubborn to Tell My Mother. And you'll see if you open it up, it's a list of 12 things. It's just what it says. I'm too stubborn to tell my mother. Now, these kind of list essays are all over the internet. People call them listicles, and many of them are silly and kind of, like 10 things to remind your husband to do before Dad's Day, or 15 cool restaurants to visit in Kansas, or 72 things you should never do before you go to bed. Those are fine. Those are information lists, but you can actually make a really thoughtful, revealing essay with a list. You'll see that in the 12 points, I sort of talk about all the things that my mother and I never talked about, like the mirror that I broke of hers, and I lied about it for years. The time I never paid her these grapes after we had a bet. Her alcoholism, which we didn't talk about either. And some of the items in the list are like one sentence, and some of them are a whole paragraph. And that's what can make a list essay really fun, is if you think about a relationship or something you want to say to someone or something you want to say about the world and make a list, you can vary the length of the items and use it as a storytelling device. So that is a really fun one to try, especially to kick off. If you can think, what kind of list could I tell that says something about me and what I think about the world? Some essays are lists, but they just look like an essay. So there's another one we're going to put up that is by Genevieve Hudson. She's a wonderful writer. She just came out with a book called The Boys of Alabama, I think. And she wrote a personal essay about her childhood in Alabama called The Boys That Made Me. And it came out in Elle just today, I think. And basically that looks like an essay. There's paragraphs, just like you'd see in a regular essay. There's no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But in the essay, she basically talks about 3 friends she has as a boy. 3 friends she had when she was a girl who were boys, and how those boys helped shape her identity and what she learned from them. So if you look at how the essay was organized, it basically says, I had 3 friends who were boys that really, taught me all these things. And then she proceeds to write like one paragraph about the first boy named Colt, who was her boyfriend, and they kissed on the golf course, and he made her start feeling like really girlish, and she was uncomfortable with that, kind of wearing frilly dresses or whatever. And the second paragraph then is about the other boy that she had, who was her childhood friend who died. And then the third paragraph is about a boy she was friends with in high school who was kind of a rebellious teenager and how they related. And at the end, she sort of talks about how these relationships with these different boys helped her see herself differently, either in a feminine kind of way or as a tomboy, or questioning her gender and all the things that she thought about and how grateful she was for these relationships, which is kind of what any essay is going to lead you to. When we learned about essays in school, it was like your introduction would just absolutely mirror your conclusion. There was no new thought. You just said what you thought, snakes are interesting, and you ended with snakes are interesting. You never went to a new place with it, or were rarely, it didn't seem like that very much. With these kind of stories, we're giving a list, and then it's leading to Genevieve to a new idea, which you can too. That's the most beautiful thing about essay writing. It takes you to a new place and a new idea and a new question. Another essay technique that I really love is the compare and contrast. So actually, we'll share this essay that I wrote for Oprah a long time ago about cheese sticks. And in that essay, in compare and contrast essays, you take two things and you put them next to each other. Okay, like apple and orange, and how do they relate? So in the first part of this essay, I just basically tell the story of how my husband tried to get me and my sons to stop eating cheese sticks because they were expensive and they were bad quality. And he wanted us to eat big balls of mozzarella cheese, which was real cheese, and then slice them, okay, as snacks. And we were like laughing at him and running around, and we refused that. We did not want to slice our snacks. We just wanted to open up that cheese stick wrapper and eat that cheese stick. And then the other idea that I'm putting that against, okay, is a conflict with my husband about cheese sticks, and it is a lunch I had with a woman who I had never met her before. We had lunch. It was maybe the first time I'd ever hung out with her, and she proceeded to tell me like every crazy thing that had happened to her life, lovers and stuff involving her reproductive health and her mother's death, and on it went. I mean, lots and lots of things. And I was a little freaked out about it because I didn't know whether I was supposed to share or not. I didn't really talk that way to people. Somehow what I did was I took the two things, cheese sticks, and how easy they are to unwrap. That's why I love them on that plastic. And how I wanted an unwrapping of a friend. When I met someone, I didn't want them to just present it all to me. I wanted to at least have the process where we took time and unwrapped and learned about each other before we just jumped into friendship. Two different things connected by a question. So another example of this, and this was one of my most favorite essays I've ever read, and I still remember it to this day, is by an author named Michelle Wilgen, who is just like a wonderful novelist who writes a lot about food. And she wrote this essay, again, a compare-contrast essay. It's called, I believe, like We Ate and Drank While the Warning Signals Blared. I don't actually think that title is great, just by the way, but what I love about her comparing and contrasting is she takes her allergy to seafood. She's someone who loved food and loved shellfish, but she began to get allergic. The doctor said she was allergic. She had an allergic reaction, but she continued to eat shellfish because she just couldn't face that she was allergic to it. And at the end of somewhere in the essay, she actually ends up going to the hospital. So her husband, the other thing that she's positing against, right, there's the shellfish and her allergy, is her husband's alcoholism, where he's drinking and they know he has a problem, but neither of them will admit or understand that he's an alcoholic yet. So these two things are posited against each other. And she's talking about her refusal to admit that she's allergic to shellfish, and his refusal to admit that he's addicted to alcohol. And as she tells these two stories, she's comparing and contrasting. What the question that unites them is like, when do we admit the real problem? I mean, does somebody have to go to the hospital because they ate a mussel, or does somebody have to go to the hospital or get hit by a car or whatever? All these things associated with alcoholism. How do you live together in a marriage when there's these delusions? So it's super skillfully written and it's a lot of fun. Sometimes I think when you're writing a compare and contrast essay, it helps to start with one story, just the one that you want to tell, this meaningful moment. Maybe it's your shellfish allergy, or maybe it's just how much you love cheese sticks. God knows I do. I could write a lot about cheese sticks, even more essays if I had time. And that will lead you to the contrasting story. If you can start with one, often you'll find of a second that seems linked once you start realizing what you're doing as you're writing. Which sort of brings me to my final point, which is my favorite kind of essay. It is actually the hardest one to write, even though it's the simplest. There's no list, there's no comparing and contrasting. It's just storytelling. You simply tell a story that we all know how to tell a story. Like we've all told the story about the time that our daughter, I don't know, I'm making it up. I don't have a daughter, but somebody's daughter threw a sprinkler in Great Edna's queen size bed, or the time that Ronnie slipped on a banana peel and hit his head. We all know those stories. We tell them over the dinner table. And in this way, you would tell a story. So an example of this is this essay I wrote for the Times a long time ago called "The Family That Takes No for an Answer." In that story, I wrote it just like the way you would read a story in a book. You get to set it up. It's a story that took place in Idaho when my dad and I were going ghost hunting with my husband. And what happened was we went goose hunting. We live in a very remote area. It was very cold. It was winter. And we went down and my dad shot a goose and it fell into the frozen river, which wasn't completely frozen, and the water took the goose down the river. And my husband, who is not from the outdoors, began just chasing after the goose. And it got very dark and we could not find him. My dad and I were looking everywhere for him. We looked in the river and we looked in this forest. We got more and more and more and more and more worried that he had fallen into the water or gotten disoriented. Should we call, I don't know, the police? Anyway, that story, which I tell, ultimately my husband does come home. And then I start talking about what that story made me think about. And what it started making me think about was the role of hope. Like when you're hoping for someone and when you're telling yourself when you're actually hoping something will happen, and when you're being deluded about it, the two different things. So there's the story and then a moment of insight, a question you're asking that the story makes you think about. Another really, really, really good example of this is an essay I worked on with Toni Morrison when I was at Oprah. And I think we're going to share that with you too, called like the time I don't know, I didn't run away. I think that's what it's called. And she tells the story very straightforward. She was going home from the library and a man came up behind her and she could hear him. And while she was, fantasizing that he was going to like hit her on the head or, maybe assault her in some way, and she's terrified, she did something very interesting. She turned around and she said, like, leave me alone. She confronted him and he backed away. Now, obviously, that could be dangerous, if it didn't work out right. But for her, that was a moment where she said, I wasn't afraid and I stood up for myself. And that changed how I thought about myself for the rest of my life. I faced my fear and I did not run or scream or cry. I just simply, acted with bravery, and it worked. And of course, she's Toni Morrison, so it's like, of course, it's wonderfully, wonderfully evocative, and it reads just like her novels do. And her moment of insight is just a sentence or two, which is what that moment of insight can be. Literally sentences, of what you think, what that adds, why did you tell this story, and why are you? Which is kind of like the most wonderful thing about essay writing, is it leads you to question moments in your life that you're always thinking about. It leads you to articulate thoughts that you normally wouldn't have wandered your way into if you hadn't actually written that story about your real life. That's why I enjoy it so much more. It is kind of a polished version of a journal with more insight and more depth. And I'm actually surprised, because you kind of never know where you're going to end up at that moment of insight. I don't think it's pre-planned in general. I mean, maybe some people do, but I don't. I know that not everybody wants to publish their essay. They want to maybe give it or just put it away or just do it to have fun. But there are lots of places where you, especially now, that you can send your essays once you finish them. I don't think it's a good, as an editor, I would probably advise against just sending people ideas of essays. I would actually just finish the essay. I think that gives any editor a good idea of what your skills are. And there are places like, actually at Catapult, if you look up Catapult Publishing, there's a community service there where you can just post your essays, which is really fun. Like, you don't have to get them accepted. You can just post them and share them and talk to other writers and share your story if you feel comfortable. Or you can actually, most editors will just, if you write an editor and you can find out their addresses on the internet, God, no, the internet is lucky that way. If you describe your essay and it feels interesting, they often read them. I know I always did. I even got essays off of Facebook. Someone say, like, I wrote an essay, and I know I bought one like that about this cat called Popcorn, and it was wonderful. One of the best things I ever published. So I really do hope you enjoy exploring this form, and that it leads you to some kind of excitement and creativity during these days where we really need it. We really have to go inside ourselves and imagine the world. I wish you nothing but good writing. Are there any questions, Ava?
There are. This is a great one that we got from Wendy. She says, when telling real stories, there's a risk of including details about real people who are still alive. How do you deal with that?
Well, that is a really good question. So there's a couple ways. One is that you can rename them. I almost always rename people because I just don't want people knowing my children's lives or their names or anything about them, or even my husband. And so that's one thing. You have to rename people. Sometimes I have changed little details about their life to help protect the person, so I'm not exposing them. So if they live in Idaho or something, I might say they live in Nebraska. And if they have brown hair, I might say they have, black hair. I'm trying to protect that person because, like, people in my family don't really want to be the starring roles in my essays. I don't really worry about changing those details until after I've written the essay. I write the essay emotionally true as it happened to me. And then if I have to change details later, I do. And also, I would never put an essay in public with other people in it about real things unless you've talked to that person and said, look, I wrote this essay about Grandma Sue. You wanna read it before would you read it, or would you mind if I put it out in public? I mean, I always do that because it's very painful to people to see their lives kind of splayed out in public without any kind of heads up. Is there another question? I think we're almost out of time, but I could probably take one more.
No, we have time for at least one or two. Do you recommend any tools like meditation or mindfulness techniques to help you as you're experiencing emotions around the journaling and essay writing?
I don't, because to me, but I know that it can help other people. I really do. Like, I seriously need to meditate. About 100,000 people who love me in my life have been like, Leigh, if you don't meditate, you'd be so much happier. But for me, in many ways, writing is meditation. That's the thing. It's like when I'm writing and you get into that flow, right? you're in that moment of the writing, and I'm trying to get to those feelings through writing. That's how I like process a lot of feelings, and I think it helps a lot of people process it. Sometimes it gets upsetting. I remember when I was writing my memoir, I mean, I would start like crying. I would be writing really early in the morning and writing these scenes from my past, and I would cry sometimes. And I guess I could have meditated, but I just kind of let it flow through me. Is like I hit a nerve there. That's where I was trying to get to a place of feeling, and sometimes the feeling is sad, and sometimes the feeling is happy.
Thank you for that. Do you have any favorite questions that you ask yourself while you're essay writing?
Um, well, one thing is like I always want writing to be meaningful, like there to be meaning behind what I'm doing. So sometimes I'll ask myself, like, if I'm getting cute, am I getting too funny? Did I go deep enough? Because I want to get to like the gold, and sometimes I can be, if I get a little flippant or a little sitcom-y, or a little, did I tell it so that like I appeared better than everybody else? That's not really true either, right? Like sometimes you're like, I'm the good guy in this, but no, probably not. So those are the kind of questions I try and ask myself. Always, I don't do it. I don't do it all the way through, because part of it is also if you're asking yourself and talking to yourself, there's a lot of editing. You might stop writing, right? In my opinion, I just kind of write it out and then ask those questions later and see what I can change in the second draft. I'm a big drafter, lots of drafts.
That's great. So
Okay.
we touched on this on the last event briefly, but there's a question about whether or not you write in ink on your computer, and if you have any thoughts about whether it makes a difference or not.
I always write essays on my computer. I have never written an essay by hand. And whereas I do love journaling by hand. So that's two, but I guess maybe that reflects different styles, right? Like the journal is kind of immediate, and it's sort of like, for me, it's like middle of the night, like I'm super worried about my sick kid getting into high school or his grades or whatever. I just kind of bleh. And essay writing, I'm really kind of like, I remember that thing that happened to me. I'm going to write about that thing. And I type it because I started writing when I was 16 years old. I had an old Apple IIe that my Uncle Dick gave me. And I learned how to type when I was like 15. It was radically different for me. And I sort of think that way. I think with my hands like that. It would be very hard, I think, almost for me to write now with my hand. And I'm pretty dyslexic also. So I'm not even sure if I could read it. But I think it's like you do what is the most comfortable and for you. That's my theory. If you are comfortable, you will write well. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed seeing you again. And you can, if you missed the journaling talk, you can go onto the website for the campfire and go back and revisit it. There's a tape of it, I think. And yes. I will hopefully see you next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Leigh. We can't wait to see you next week. And thank you to everyone for inviting the Girl Scout Network into your homes. We'll be hosting a wide variety of campfire chats, so be sure to stay up to date with our offerings on girlscouts.org/campfire chats. That's where you can find Leigh's journaling event. You won't want to miss our next event on Wednesday, Creativity During Quarantine, with visual artist Chantal Martin and memoirist Leigh Newman, in conversation with Amri Kibler, co-founder at Hey Mama. In the meantime, you can support Girl Scouts with Cookie Care, which allows you to buy boxes online and have them shipped safely to your home, or donate them directly to first responders on the front lines of COVID-19. Your generosity will also help support the 1.7 million Girl Scouts depending on the Cookie program to fund life-changing girl-led programs. The link has been posted in the chat log and will be available in the follow-up email to today's event, or you can buy now at girlscouts.org/cookiecare. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to welcoming you back at our next event.